Thanks everyone for coming. The recent failure of Silicon Valley Bank is a strong reminder that banks need sound supervision. The bank was grossly mismanaged. Due to a combination of negligence and avarice, it missed obvious excessive risks. Wall Street banks are doing much the same in their reckless approach to fossil fuel financing today. SVB's failure is also a powerful reminder that bank oversight has been far too lax. The Federal Reserve failed to respond timely or appropriately to obvious risks at SVB that were sitting in plain sight. It had noticed some of the problems and was studying them and thinking about acting, but it hadn't acted yet. Again, the same is true in the context of climate-related financial risk. Responses to the SVB failure have also given us some powerful reminders, namely that some here on Capitol Hill would rather play politics and serve corporate donors than maintain a safe and secure banking system. The same is certainly true in the context of climate-related financial risk, where some politicians are waging a campaign to intimidate bank regulators into doing even less than they're already doing now. The Fossil-Free Finance Act offers a solution to these problems. It would require the Fed to supervise a process under which big banks align their activities with science-based climate targets. The Fed already has the authority to do this, and it should already be doing this kind of action. It just isn't. At present, big banks are still financing fossil fuels wildly in excess of science-based climate targets, even while a rapid transition to a clean energy economy is well underway and keeps hastening, and even while the banks themselves claim to be supportive of meeting Paris Agreement targets. Every year, instead of helping us meet those targets, they pump more and more gas into a massive carbon bubble. And every year, the risk that it will burst spectacularly grows. The Fed needs to start letting air out of that bubble carefully, deliberately, and quickly before it's too late. That same financing, of course, is fueling the extreme weather that's killing people in this country, causing billions of dollars of damage every year, and beginning to strain the solvency of insurers and will soon strain the solvency of some banks. And that's before the harms worsen into the type that become threats to human civilization. The need for this bill has never been clearer or more urgent, and we owe a huge debt of thanks and gratitude to our sponsors for their leadership in introducing it today. We'll hear from them now. First is Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts. Senator Markey is a national leader on the environment and the climate crisis. Throughout his career, he's repeatedly taken steps to push back against the forces driving climate change, including investments by big banks. As a lead Senate sponsor of this bill, the Fossil-Free Finance Act, he's advancing a critical tool to hold Wall Street accountable for fueling both the climate crisis and likely financial crises. So thank you, Senator Markey, and welcome.
Thank you, David, so much. Thank you all so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you, David. Thank you to David and everyone at Public Citizen for helping to host today's exciting event. I'm honored to be joined by my friends and partners in the House of Representatives, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib, as well as Tanya Clay, House Executive Vice President of the Hip Hop Caucus. Today, we are gathered because the climate crisis is threatening our very existence, and it's going to take everyone, especially big banks and big finance, which have played a major role in bringing us to this crisis point. If we're going to keep our economy and our earth from collapsing, we're going to need the cooperation of big finance in the United States, because fighting the climate crisis is about saving our future. And fighting to protect our economy from climate risks is about our future savings. Banks are supposed to keep our economy safe. They shouldn't be gambling our economy on risky investments that will supercharge climate change by doubling down on our fossil-fueled past. When banks take on climate risk, they are playing fast and loose with our economy. your savings, your retirement, your financial security are all at risk. We need to build a financial system that can survive the climate crisis, not fuel the climate crisis. The largest banks have been providing billions in fossil fuel financing since nations came together on the Paris Agreement in 2015. JP Morgan Chase financed $317 billion in fossil fuels since 2015. Citigroup financed $237 billion. Wells Fargo financed $223 billion. Bank of America financed $198 billion. Those four banks alone are bankrolling nearly $1 trillion towards fossil fuels. Some banks are already coming to realize that this isn't a sane or science-based strategy. Two of those same banks, Bank of America and Citibank, have publicly committed to reaching net zero financing by 2050. We're going to hold them accountable to that, but we're going to ask them to do a lot better than 2050. The planet is running a fever. There are no emergency rooms for planets. We have to put the preventative care financial strategies in place in order to avoid the worst, most catastrophic consequences. So ultimately, though, we're going to need a mechanism for demanding accountability. The Federal Reserve has a responsibility to protect financial stability, but it is not doing enough. The Fed can and must make sure banks and managing climate risk, especially at a time where we have seen firsthand how some bank executives have been acting irresponsibly. Today, that is why Congresswoman Pressley and Tlaib and I are excited to reintroduce the Fossil-Free Finance Act. The bill would require the Federal Reserve to properly address the systemic risks that climate change will pose to our financial system and force the big banks like Bank of America, Citi, Morgan Stanley, and JP Morgan Chase to develop transition plans. Specifically, the bill would require banks to reduce financed emissions by 50% by 2030. 50% by 2030. Eliminate all financed emissions by 2050. Stop financing of fossil fuel projects after 2030, and much more. The bill would also require banks to submit plans that prioritize financing for companies that help workers affected by a clean energy transition and removes financing from projects that cause disproportionate harm to communities. And lastly, the Fossil-Free Finance Act requires the Fed to report and share progress made by banks on their targets. We've seen what bank mismanagement can do to our economy. It threatens jobs, it threatens industries, it threatens our security. We can't stand by and watch banks throw your money behind investments that are risky for you and risky for the climate. We know that the United States has a goal of 50% all new electric vehicles by 2030. We know that Germany has a goal of 65% all new vehicles being electric by 2030. So we're looking at the decline of the fossil fuel industry as people go all electric. And what the fossil fuel industry is saying right now is drill, baby, drill. And what the rising generation of Americans are saying is plug in, baby, plug in. Move away from the all-electric vehicle. Future is to destroy our planet. So we're going to put additional pressure on the financing mechanisms at the banks to make sure that we go all electric, that we just leave this fossil fuel industry in the rearview mirror of history. So that's our opportunity. That's what this legislation is all about. Thank you, David. Thank you to Public Citizen for all of your leadership. Thank you. No, David, I think.
Oh, right.
I can introduce you.
That's right. Follow the run of show.
You need no introduction, obviously.
Yeah.
So thank you, Senator Markey. Our next speaker needs no introduction, but I'm going to do it anyway. She's been a tireless advocate in her work to ensure the Federal Reserve protects workers and families. She's a dedicated environmental justice champion, and we're so excited to have her lead the House version of the Fossil Free Finance Act. Also from the great state of Massachusetts, representing the 7th District, Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Thank you, David and Public Citizen, for all you do, your critical work in this movement. Thank you to Senator Markey, my Massachusetts colleague and partner in good, who has for decades been the canary in the coal mine on so many issues relative to climate and environmental justice, a true pace setter in the climate movement. And of course, thank you to my classmate and my co-FSC committee member and dear friend Rashida Tlaib, who is always leading on issues of consequence, especially related to racial, climate, and environmental justice. Let me just make it plain. Climate change is real. Climate change is here. And climate change is impacting every aspect of our lives, from public health to infrastructure to racial justice. For constituents living in the Massachusetts 7th, which I have the honor of representing in communities like East Boston and Chelsea and Everett, climate change is a reality they are already grappling with. These cities are located close to the coast and are experiencing an increased frequency of extreme weather events such as flooding, storm surges, rising sea levels, and heavy rainfall. We're also seeing the extreme impacts of climate change across the world, from heat waves killing tens of thousands of people each year, to tornadoes and wildfires tearing through neighborhoods, to sharp increases in the intensity of global droughts and floods. Yet even as these extreme events lead to crop failures and humanitarian crises in the United States and globally, big banks continue to pour hundreds of billions of dollars into more financing for fossil fuel infrastructure. This is unsustainable, and it is literally killing us. It's clear that big banks are ignoring the threat of climate change and putting profits over people. Our financial system is not prepared to deal with the risk of climate change, and our regulators are dragging their feet, refusing to do the right thing, and require the banks to address these risks. This must end. We saw with the collapse of Silicon Valley Bank that when regulators act too slowly, the broader financial system can come under threat. The risks posed by banks that fail to adapt to climate change are similar. We could see sudden reevaluations of assets, collapsing deposit bases, and a lack of sufficient oversight and regulation. That's why we need to pass our Fossil Free Finance Act. I wish I had one of those quotable one-liners like you, Senator. I'm going to work on it. So for now, I'll just say we need to pass our Fossil Free Finance Act to ensure that the regulators do what is necessary to protect our financial system from climate risk. Our bill will mandate that all banks with assets higher than $50 billion align their financing with science-based emission targets. The Fossil Free Finance Act will incorporate the financing of emissions into the systematically important financial institutions designations process and require the Federal Reserve to report regularly to Congress on their efforts. The moment to act on climate change was yesterday, but we still have time. Time to pass our bill and stop banks from financing the climate crisis any further. Again, I thank all of our siblings in the movement for joining us here today and for what you do on the front lines each and every day. I urge my colleagues to support this bill that simply cannot wait any longer. And I yield.
Thank you, Congresswoman Pressley. We're also proud to have Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib joining us and joining Senator Markey and Representative Pressley in supporting the Fossil Free Finance Act. Representing Michigan's 12th District, Congresswoman Tlaib has been an environmental champion, and her willingness to push the Federal Reserve has helped keep attention on the way its monetary and regulatory policies should serve all people and not just the wealthy. Please welcome her.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David and Public Citizen, who have been incredibly wonderful in helping elevate the voices of my residents at home. Thank you so much to the leadership and the courageous leadership, really, of Senator Markey, and of course my good sister in service, Congresswoman Pressley. In my district and across Michigan, we've seen the effects of climate crisis firsthand. I have this thing where I like to make sure that I bring my district to Congress so people understand over and over again the impact of doing nothing. Floods are supposed to occur, as we all know, every 100 years. But right now, especially in my district, I see extreme weather events are being more and more deadly, ravaging our communities and threatening the lives of our residents. But as our communities flood and as our planet burns, the Federal Reserve has not felt any urgency to act. Over the last 8 years, banks provided over $3.8 trillion in direct fossil fuel financing, with most of the investment coming from bank holding companies under the Fed's supervision. The Federal Reserve have consistently lagged behind our European central banks in addressing climate risk, as we all know. Either the Federal Reserve thinks its European counterparts are overreacting, or they simply are failing to lead. But the climate crisis is here, and Wall Street isn't going to do the right thing on its own. So the Fed has a supervisor responsibility, and I would argue a moral imperative to address the systematic risk climate poses to our financial system and our economy. It is incredibly important because since the responsibility has so far proven to be too subjective for the Board of Governors, we've given them explicit targets in this bill, the very targets outlined by the Paris Agreement needed to meet our IPCC climate goals. It's simple math, y'all. The only way we can curb the rise in global temperature of 1.5 degrees Celsius is by halting new fossil fuel projects and aggressively reducing financed emissions by 2050. The Federal Reserve has a responsibility to address the climate crisis, as we know. And again, we can't not do this without the partners and those that continue to speak truth to power on this issue. And again, right now, my residents are feeling it. They're feeling it every single day. And I cannot tell you, when you speak to one of my seniors who got flooded twice this past summer, who was so elderly, she was in her 70s, she actually, Senator Markey, could not go to her basement because it froze. The water froze in her basement. She had no way or any way to take it out. And then now she has to deal with mold and so many other things. Again, costing so much money and resources, and her life is completely altered. She didn't deserve that. We can act now to address the climate crisis. Thank you again to the leadership of Senator Markey and, of course, Congresswoman Pressley. I appreciate it so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
I do have a saying. I've read it before. I can't claim it's mine. But drilling is killing. There you go.
That's a good one. Tell it to Jay Powell. Well, thank you, Congresswoman Tlaib, for your leadership and your support on this. Our next speaker, Tanya Clay House, is the Executive Vice President for Campaigns and Advocacy at the Hip Hop Caucus. Hip Hop Caucus advocates for an economy that works for everyone, with a mission that is rooted firmly in the belief that racial justice, economic justice, and climate justice are interwoven. This is Clay House.
First, I want to give thanks to Public Citizen. I also want to give thanks to Senator Markey, give thanks to Congresswoman Tlaib. Thank you to Congresswoman Pressley for supporting the reintroduction of this bill. My name is Tanya Clay House. I am the Executive Vice President of the Hip Hop Caucus. We are celebrating 50 years of hip hop this year. And you may wonder, what is it that the Hip Hop Caucus has to do with climate change? Hip hop has always been about storytelling, communicating what's happening in our communities. It's always been about giving the narrative about how things are impacting Black and brown communities and all communities of color, all communities, period. That's why we're here, because we know that the intersections are there between what is happening in our climate and what is happening in the communities, our hip hop communities. 50 years, y'all, that's all of us. Hip hop has evolved, and so has the storytelling as to what is happening in our communities. Our communities are typically and always, not typically, they are always the first impacted and the worst impacted. The caucus is a 21st century organization that is committed to social justice, through the use of culture, including storytelling, communications, federal and state advocacy, grassroots and digital organizing, and so much more. And we are here to make sure that everyone understands that this is about all of us. Everyone knows that this climate change is real, as what we've been saying, and that we cannot ignore what is right in front of our faces. We're excited to see the reintroduction of the Fossil Free Finance Act. Big banks have long been propping up polluters over people. And bailouts to banks and the fossil fuel industry persist while everyday people and frontline communities are left holding the bag. The Fossil Free Finance Act is an important step towards eradicating this disproportionate impacts of climate change on Black, brown, and indigenous communities. It will do this by cutting off the flow of money towards destructive, extractive industries that would help stop projects like Willow and Keystone XL before they ever get to the ground, lifting organized people over organized money. This legislation lines up with campaigns that we already have in effect. Our own Bank Black and Green campaign, which asks black banks to pledge to not make investments in corporations that profit off of the backs of Black lives, such as those involved in fossil fuel proliferation and mass incarceration. Most recently, we did have a meeting with Bank of America, and I appreciate the commitment that they have given, but 2015 is too far. Climate change is impacting us now. We do need things to happen now. The caucus is also pledged with our like-minded coalitions here, such as Public Citizen, Third Act, Stop the Money Pipeline, and so many more, to pressure these big banks to stop investing in fossil fuels, which contribute to the environmental justice in places like Cancer Alley, the Texas Gulf, and the Ohio River Valley. This act supports that mission by mandating financial institutions with over $50 billion in assets to align their risk portfolio with science-based emissions. Now, we know that since the original introduction in the 117th Congress, that U.S. financial regulators have acknowledged that climate change and the energy transition are an emerging risk to the financial system. The physical impacts of climate change threaten the value of mortgages and businesses that secure most bank loans. This is the intersection. We know that this is something that must happen, and actually to support all of our industries here. So we must use the power of the Federal Reserve, and this legislation is there to help ensure that we can move forward in this progress. So therefore, we thank everyone here today. We again stand with Senator Markey, Congresswoman Pressley, Congresswoman Tlaib, Public Citizen, and the many other organizations here to support this legislation today and urge swift consideration and passage. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Just say thank you again to all our sponsors and our speakers, and we're happy to take questions.
How do you see the priorities of this bill fitting in with SEC's disclosure? Is that going to drive it similar to the outcomes that you're looking for, or is it not?
Yeah, this dovetails with that effort. We have to keep the pressure on. What the SEC is considering, obviously, is saying to large corporations in America, factor in climate, factor in the impact that it's having upon your business model as well. So we're doing the same thing with this legislation. And obviously, there are some that are moving more aggressively, but still not fast enough. And so the totality of this is that a vision without funding is an hallucination. If we want to have a vision for a clean energy future, but the financing isn't there and continues to focus upon a fossil fuel past that they want to extend indefinitely into the future, then we won't solve this problem. And Black, brown, communities of color all across the United States are going to continue to suffer from those big bank decisions, and the most vulnerable countries around the world, the poorest as well, will suffer because of those big bank decisions. So we know that fossil fuels are going to be declining. We just want the financial system to get ahead of the curve and to be leading while making money for their investors. Thank you all so much. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Great.
Thank you, Vice. Thank
My
you so
best to
much.
Reverend Yearwood,
I
please.
will. I will. He was caught in a meeting, one of those where they just take your phone and don't let you out.
No problem.
And so
No, but thank you. Well, you were better.
You're fantastic.